maybe. There we go. Cool. Well, thank you everybody for joining on this fine Tuesday. It looks like it's going to be a warm one, so hopefully after this, by the end of the day, you can go outside if you want to and enjoy some rays. As always, we post a lot of our stuff on Meetup. We do have a Slack and YouTube, so if you miss any of these meetings or want to reference one back, feel free to check it out there or reach out to any one of us if you have any more specific questions or idea or comments. Today we'll be giving a talk on Azure Static Sites. On the 22nd, we'll be giving a talk over Azure Synapse. And then the 8th topic is coming soon, so keep a lookout for that. As always, if you want to learn, there's some free opportunities out there in Pluralsight, and you can also join our Slack if you have any questions, comments. Always open to topic suggestions. I do want to thank our sponsors. This is a new slide we have for Platinum Source Allies and Bronze Lozano Tech Inc. And that leads me to today's featured sponsor of Source Allies. I'll hand it off to you, Carter.
Yeah, what a cool slide that is. Thank you for the addition there, Mr. Harrison. Hey, so I think I know a lot of the people on this call or have spoken with or have met. So I don't need to go too much in depth of what Source Allies is. What I can say is that we're really excited to sponsor these kinds of groups. Personally, from an account management perspective, I see a lot more Azure popping up these days. So cool to see all the people here. If you don't have DevOps or cloud engineering in your tool set yet, I highly encourage it. At Source Allies, we do software consulting, and our clients look for us to be kind of full stack engineers, which means everything from HTML, CSS, JavaScript, backend languages, C#, Java, to databases, and now inclusive of the cloud. So just really excited to be able to sponsor these kinds of groups. You got great leaders in Derek and Alec and whomever else I may not be saying. If there's ever anything I can do for you, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'm pretty easily found. But thank you, Alec. Back to you.
Thanks. With that, we'll kick off today's presentation. Let's see, in Azure Static Sites. The plan of this is kind of going to talk about the costs, the pros and cons of static sites, kind of what I've seen using these at professionally and personally, and then also some of the pros and cons, and then we'll build your first CI/CD pipeline, your YAML file or bicep file, and then get this all going with GitHub Actions. And then I'll show you also a free example of my own personal site is hosted with static sites. So I can kind of show you, you know, some of the claims are as good as can be true, or are as true as claimed. We can get back to that, but we'll dig a little deeper into that. So let's play from the beginning. So Azure Static Sites, if you go and play in the UI of Azure and go to a portal and find the static web apps, this is kind of the two choices you're supposed to make right off the bat. What does this kind of mean to the normal person? What does this mean to an enterprise client? There's kind of some things here that you look on and debate kind of which use case will help satisfy your needs. So they say standard is supposed to be for general purpose production apps, and free is supposed to be for hobby or personal use. The differences, we'll dig in a little deeper. What you do get for both is custom domains and free SSL certs. So if you don't want to put a pretty URL in front of your app and everybody's okay with that, either one of these both give you free SSL certs. So you don't have to go and, you know, buy a custom domain or whatnot if this isn't something that needs to be user facing, or if it's something that your clients just bookmark and never care about again. The max app sizes are another thing that you might want to look into. As far as what does that mean for you, as far as Obviously, if you go over, you're not going to be able to be in the free tier anymore. Let's start digging into some of these more of these columns. So if you go to the actual website that they have linked there, or the calculate price, you get another fun chart, which isn't quite the same, but is similar. So we'll start going through some of those. The price is free with an asterisk. Well, for the sake of argument, we'll get to where the asterisk comes in, but we'll just call it free for now for comparing apples to apples. So the standard one is $9 per app per month. There is an included bandwidth of 100 gigs. That's the same across. Bandwidth overage is kind of the big one. It is not applicable for free. We'll get into that next slide. And then custom domains. For your free app, you're only going to have 2 per app, which, if you just have a bunch of environments and you're going to deploy a free custom static site per environment, you may never ever hit 2. But if you're going to have like a company website or something where if you want like every slight misspelling of your website, you may want to go to the standard, because then you can have all these custom domains pointing back to your same static site. Service-defined authentication, that's for both. We'll dig a little deeper into authentication, dig a little deeper into storage, and Azure Functions and Front Door. And then another thing to point out is the free one does not have an SLA. So if all of Azure goes down, you won't be reimbursed for it. Kind of makes sense, because reimbursement's based on your charges. If you're not paying anything for it, there's nothing really there to reimburse you for. The biggest thing that I would be cautious about is the bandwidth. So if we go back to this chart, you have 100 gigabyte per subscription bandwidth. So if you're hosting like a bunch of people's websites and that's getting millions in traffic, so like think of your Facebooks, right? You only have 100 gigs worth per subscription. I believe it's per month, period. If you go over on the free tier, they just kill your site. It is not publicly accessible anymore. And that's the path they go down with that. So if you're using a high availability or, a highly active site, or a lot of them in your subscriptions, you may want to also go the standard plan, because that is also going to start charging you 20 cents per gig per subscription of overage, instead of just killing your stuff altogether. I think for a lot of use cases, hitting 100 gigs per subscription, it's a little bit of a stretch from what I've seen, but there's also use cases where that wouldn't be a stretch, especially if you're hosting tons of things. And that might be a more realistic benchmark or thing to hit for other people. Bringing your own functions was another thing that only the premium has, and right here is kind of the difference in chart of the difference between bringing your own functions and not. If you're going to use managed functions, which does work for free, you can only do HTTP for triggers. You can only use their supported runtimes. You can only do consumption-based functions. You have to do integrated security and route integration. So if you want to do something like your own runtime, you want to use like Go or some other language that isn't supported as a runtime, but can compile, you're kind of out of luck unless you do a standard tier. You also don't have the durable functions programming model, which is essentially you can do like fan out, fan in functions. So if you want to, one piece of work triggers a mountain of other work or computation, that doesn't work with your free tier. App service authentication, authorization and authentication for token management. That kind of works. We'll get into that a little more. And then functions and key vault references are other two big ones. So static site auth, if we go into there, there is 3 auth providers kind of built in. If you don't need anything, if you need more than that, it's not considered built in or one of the main providers. So you would have to go to the standard plan. So like Azure Active Directory, GitHub, and Twitter, the 3 that they decided to bring in and call as something that is managed there. We've personally used MCell at Grower's Edge for our static sites and used router guards and all that fun stuff. So it does support Azure AD pretty well. Anything past that, like I believe your Auth0 and all those, I believe, do have to go through the standard one, unless you can find a way to make your static site, be able to be somewhat more dynamic. I think you could probably use remote config and kind of fudge those static and auth providers. So you could theoretically do a remote config file and attempt to get around these limitations, but just know out of the gate, they kind of only build support with Azure AD, GitHub, and Twitter. And here's where the asterisk I was talking about kind of comes into play. The only thing you're paying for in the free tier static site is your storage. This is the Blob storage costs if you pull them up. And I think the asterisk is still there because I'll show you a real example. It doesn't really cost this much. Most of them are stored as hot objects. So you're looking at basically, if you round up 2 cents per gig, which is next to nothing. And I'll show you Microsoft, for the most part, I don't think charges you for that unless you get really big. So I'll show you my personal site, which has been up for at least 6 or 7 months, and it doesn't even register on the cost center. And this is regardless of tier. So if you get a really big web app that's like very, massive, you're going to pay potentially Blob storage costs, but there is I believe 250 megabyte and 500 megabyte limitation per static site that you'll hit before you'll hit some of these. So that's really going to be your limiting factor, not so much the cost of Blob storage. And then the other upsell they try to give you is Azure Front Door. So Front Door does not work for the free tier. And kind of a high level overview of what Front Door is. It's just basically kind of what it sounds. It's a front door for your applications. It's supposed to be a single entry point for everything to come into your system. There's some health tools that go along with that. There's traffic rerouting. There's a bunch of other things that, if you're talking big, can help. SSL offloading, custom domains. But you can do a lot of this within your static sites. So if it's something your organization already uses, Front Door, I believe, can also help with geo redundancies. So you can deploy to multiple Azure clouds, and then Front Door will point you to the closest one to you for speed and security. But if you're building an app, it may be overkill if it's just a simple web app. But just something to know that that's another one of the selling points to go to standard. If your organization has a organization-wide front door and you want to leverage that, you would have to go and look at the standard. And here's just some references that I'll talk about today. The biggest one is probably logging into Azure. So I've talked about this in another talk I've used. This is actually going away soon-ish. So it's basically creating a JSON file that stores all your credentials that you then hide as a GitHub secret. That allows GitHub to talk to Azure. What they're moving towards in the future is a service principal model that doesn't use a secret, essentially. But for the sake of this demo, this is what I did. You just go into the Azure portal, run this command, and it'll create you a JSON that looks similar to this. And I think that is all we need for background information. So we'll go into what I'm calling the trivial example. So this is just a example to show kind of how you would go about building a pipeline and deploying your bicep file. And with that, before we kick off too far, is there any questions, comments? Cool. If you have any questions as we start doing some of this, feel free to interrupt, and I'll dig in deeper. If I'm going too fast, too slow, just let me know. So what we're going to do is we decided we wanted to deploy our first static site. So in Bicep, you're going to declare your resource. So usually when I start investigating resources, I kind of have a general idea when I'm going to do the Bicep, and I'm actually going to go back to this and click on this link, maybe. So the easiest thing to do is just basically to search the thing you're trying to do in Azure and then Bicep. This is the one for static sites. There's a lot of information here. I like to usually try to figure out what is the simplest thing, and then a lot of this other stuff is just good to know. If you want extra data collection or logging or whatnot, there's a lot of extra things that can go in here, and the vast majority of this is optional. So the thing we're really looking at is the API versions. So what we want to start with, let's go side by side here. Is the bare minimum we need to get started. So what we're going to do is declare a resource. I'm going to call it static site. And this is going to be a static site, and we'll just go with the latest release just because. All right, and then if we look here, we need a resource. Is missing a location and name. So location, I always like to do resource group, which is a function dot location. So that should put it in the location that your resource group is in. So think like US East 2, those kind of things. Most resources, you want to give a friendly name. And I also want to specify a SKU just so I know for sure I'm getting the free tier and not paying for this. And I'm going to save that. You may also, sometimes it doesn't show up. You may or may not need an empty properties tag. It just kind of depends on the resource. And sometimes when you go to deploy, it'll blow up. That since it's empty, it may not be required. I usually just throw it in there just to be safe. And then the next thing we're going to want to do is the way to hide this in Azure DevOps is a little better. So this is just kind of a demo. You should look at a better solution than this if you're going to use this in your own internal, especially if it's publicly facing. But what we're going to need down the road is a key to publish to our Azure sites. So think of this as like a token that you can use that lets GitHub tell Azure, like, hey, here's the artifact that I need you to host, and here's my credentials saying I'm allowed to do that. So for the short term, because GitHub knows this is a secret, and by default, I believe prints it, it doesn't let you do this out of the box. So you do have to tell it to disable this for the time being. And there are better ways to hide this, but this is just the first quick and dirty way I found. So we're going to call this deployment token, and it's a string. And we're going to list the secrets and do the static sites ID as a parameter, and then the static sites API version. So that's telling it which one it needs to go grab. And then the properties. And then we want the API key. So we can then output this to our overarching GitHub Actions file to be able to reference this once the resources stood up in Azure. And that's about it for our Bicep file. So with that, you can say you know how to stand up a static site with a bicep file. It's really that simple. And we'll go ahead and move on to our pipeline. And this is the equivalent to like your ARM template in Azure, your Terraform file. It's all right here. And this is, for a static site, fairly simple and straightforward, I think. So for our pipeline, we're going to just use Node.js for our CI because the Angular app I have here is just the default Angular Tour of Heroes. Nothing fancy, but we need a Node.js runner for that. This comes by default in your sample pipelines too. It's just saying whenever there's a push to main or a pull request opened up on main, we're going to run this. For the sake of this demo, I don't open up pull requests. It's just pushing straight to main, which in the real world, maybe don't do that, but it should be fine here. We're going to run it on Ubuntu latest. That's just the OS of the thing. Doesn't really matter. In this case, steps, the first thing we're going to do is check out the repository. And then the first thing we need to do after that is authenticate to Azure. And if you just Google, if I can type and talk at the same time, if you just Google Azure login, you'll find this step and it'll tell you, I believe this is just copy and pasted. It'll basically tell you to do this. And this is where the Azure credentials I kind of referenced earlier come into play. So if you go to GitHub, let me go here, this will be easier. Here, settings. Oh. When you're signed in and own the repo, there's settings, and then there's secrets that your actions can look at. And here's where we put that JSON file is right, or that JSON is right here. There's also some other things we pulled out to variables to reference, and I'll call those out when we get to them as well. But this is where this goes. This is what it's referencing, and it's using that to let Azure know that it's allowed to talk to it. So the next thing we're going to do is run our bicep deploy. So now that we're logged into Azure, we've authenticated, we want to actually run that bicep file that we just made. Sorry. Run bicep deploy. And we're going to get an ID so we can reference it later. Uses Azure ARM deploy. And for some reason, well, not for some reason, because bicep does compile down to ARM, the task is the ARM deploy step because it'll take your bicep file and turn that into ARM behind the scenes. So it might be a little confusing if you go to use this. And I thought it was weird the first time of why am I doing an ARM deploy task with a bicep file? But works out. That's the one it tells you to use. So the first parameter you have to give it is your subscription ID. And it uses the $, double brackets. And if we do secrets, that's all of our secrets. And then we had an Azure subscription secret. And then the other one is resource group name. And I'll just do the last one. So for our resource group, I just created a resource group that's just as a dummy resource group for this talk. And I'll show you that in the portal. But we reference it here. That probably doesn't need to be a secret because it doesn't really matter. And then we need to give it the path to the template, which is the current directory deploy.bicep. So assuming our runner runs as it should right now, this will log into Azure, run our bicep file against our already created resource group, and then deploy the static site that we just made, and then it'll save the output, so the deployment token that we just told it to specify here. And then as part of best practice, Microsoft recommends having your runner log out. I took this straight from an article. I believe it's at the end of the AZ login stuff. They say best practice is to make sure that you log out when you're done. That's just so the runner no longer has access to your stuff. It should die automatically once it's done running your stuff or get put away and lose all reference. But just in case, once it's done running your stuff, it's no longer authenticated with your Azure instance. And then, all right. So then the next step we want to do is, now that our infrastructure is in place, we want to actually get our code or our website to the actual static site, because right now it's just an empty container that doesn't do anything. So this is going to be our build and deploy. So you'll see my artifact or my Azure Tour of Hero or Angular Tour of Heroes here. It's just the default Angular app. Works the same as it does out of the box. I didn't do anything except an npm install. So if we do an npm start, should kick it off here, just so we know kind of what to expect. And that's going to take a second, isn't it? Live demos are always fun. There we go. And we got our site. So nothing fancy, just a default landing page. You can use this with a bunch of different kind of apps. We'll dig into that a little later. So now that we know the behavior of our app, we kind of know what to expect. So, oops. So we'll go ahead and do our build and run. I am going to copy and paste this uses. I don't know why this is this way, but this is what you're supposed to use for static web apps deploy. I believe this is specifying a version of this plugin. It's just the default one I found when I Googled it. You may be able to get away with just doing this, but got a little copy paste happy. It worked. So that's kind of where I was at. So then we need to provide it with some parameters, because right now it's not smart enough to know where our site is, what we're trying to do. The first one, and secondly most important, probably not the most important, is our API token. So this is telling the task, here's where my credentials live, so you can actually talk to Azure, go out there and actually do the deployment. Otherwise, you're going to get an unauthorized when you try to give your instance, and it's just going to fail. So up above, I mentioned we're giving it an ID of deploy. That is so we can reference this step up here and the outputs it kicks out later on, which is right here. So steps is referencing all of the steps listed here. So this is everything. Then we're going to go to the particular step we want, which we call deploy, which is right here. Then we're going to go to the outputs, which we specified here, which is our secret deploy token. And then there. So this is going to take the output here once this task is done running and has this deployment token, and put it in here. This is where you can figure out if you want to create some of your stuff manually beforehand. You can theoretically do a lot of this. Oops. You could do this stuff like creating your static site beforehand and creating the deployment token, and then just giving GitHub Actions the deployment token. Then the only thing your script would do is actually just go and push your changes whenever you make changes. This is just a more end-to-end solution for that. Action is going to be upload, and we want, because we're going to be uploading our new site, our app location, because it is the default Angular, or this is telling it where the app lives. So it knows where to run basically your npm build. And then the app artifact location. So this is where your app lives once it's done its build. So, and it also takes reference of where the app already is. So when it looks for the location, it will be inside of this directory. So wherever you specify this, you need to talk about the artifact location in relation to your app location. So because this is a default Angular app, it throws it into dist/Angular for of heroes. And we can prove that here. So if we run an npm build, we get a dist there. This shouldn't take too long. And you'll be able to see up here as this build finishes that it's going to kick out some files in here. So we're just telling the pipeline, hey, go in here, and there it goes. And this works with React and a few others as well. So whatever your React build command is, where it spits it out, all that should work the same. And that is almost it. So this pipeline, as it sits today, will work once. It'll work to go out there, check out your code, log into Azure, run in your bicep file, build and deploy, and log out. One problem with this is as your app is live, your static site is going to basically hold itself hostage to serving that site. So one thing you do need to do if you're going to do incremental deploys, because the bicep file will not want to touch and manipulate your static site since it's up, you're going to have to do a disconnect of your static site. So you'll disconnect it, run your bicep file, push up any changes, and then it'll be reconnected and work. There's very small downtime. There's some ways around that too with environments, and I believe it's called stages. But for the most part, in my projects, there hasn't been a huge need for uptime. So the 20 or 30 seconds that it's down hasn't been detrimental. But that's just something to be aware of if you're going to do a solution like this. There could potentially be downtime. So to do a disconnect, and this is something I found on Stack Overflow, and I believe if you run it, it hints you at this as well. Let me go here. And right here. So Microsoft does kind of hint you at this. If you Google this error message, it'll take you to this to disconnect to deploy it. Just as cannot change the provider. And if you Google that, it'll tell you how to do your disconnect. So we'll use the Azure CLI is the easiest way to do that. And we're already in Azure authenticated for our resource group. So we can just do this with inline script. And I'm just gonna, and we named our resource test site. So when we run it, we're gonna run the AZ static web app, disconnect, give it the name, and it'll be test site. So what this will do is it'll go out there, log into Azure, disconnect your site, allow the bicep to run, and then re-upload your site. It will not delete what's already there. So incremental updates do go faster because it'll do a check of what your package is and what's there. But you do need that if you're going to do repeated deployments.
You have a typo on line 23 before you.
Oh, thanks. And then when you deploy this, you'll get something like this. So it'll set up your job, it'll build the static web app, it'll check out your code, run login, run the disconnect, skip the bicep deploy. So I don't know. Yeah, so it does do the bicep deploy. Doesn't show your outputs here. Then the build and deploy goes through building it. You can also specify an API, which will host itself in Azure Functions, which is kind of cool. I haven't really gone into that too much because most of my sites have been self-contained, but as far as they're just front end, nothing else really powering them. And you can do that. It gives you a bunch of debug information here. And if you keep scrolling, there's a lot of debug information. But here's where I'm talking about if you don't care about what your URL is, Microsoft will give you a default SSL URL for free. So you have this not super pretty, but if you're going to tell your users just to bookmark it and come back and may satisfy whatever your needs are for free. And then there's some other information here. This is it was trying to create Azure Functions if it found my API, but since I don't have one, it doesn't do that. And then we run a zlog out, and then it kills the job and cleans it up. So in the portal, what that looks like is and ignore any mess I might have in here. So here's our static site demo resource group. Here's our test site. And if you look here, the source it'll tell us is GitHub. Its deployment history is GitHub Actions. So it'll even link back to here. And then I can go to these workflows. If I want to edit the workflow, it says it's here. It doesn't link back correctly though. One thing that is nice here, if you're prototyping or haven't set up like SSLs or waiting on somebody to give you a custom or pretty domain, you can go out and test the website. So this is the same website that it spit out in the project run or in the deployment. So if you lose that for any reason, there's multiple places to go find it. Assuming you have access to the GitHub, you can also see the source of where it's coming from. It does something similar to this if your source is Azure DevOps as well. And here's the SKU of free that we talked about. And yeah, you can also browse. This is the deployment tokens we also talked about. You can, yeah, I'm going to destroy this anyway, but here's a deployment token you can copy to your clipboard. That's where if you want to create this manually, you can do that beforehand and then deploy that way instead of having to grab it or try to hide it in your pipeline. But yeah, you can do app insights here. You can do custom domains. So you can register your custom domain and put that in front of here. And then have different environments. Here's the hosting plans. You can also fairly easily upgrade to a standard. Because we're doing it in Bicep, you probably want to do that in Bicep before changing it in the UI here. Otherwise, it might kick it back to free. So yeah, let me pull this up. It's kind of the trivial example. I do have a real life example of a site that I'm using static sites for. So to plug my own blog, it has this ugly URL, icy rock and a GUID.azure static sites. I've also gone here and created a custom domain. So these both point back to the same static site behind the scenes. This is also a Gatsby site. I attempted to write a blog on how to use GitHub Actions in Gatsby. It is pretty dang slick how easy it is to do that. The only problem I really had was a custom domain. So I did put that on the references list. If anybody's looking to get your own blog out there, Gatsby does a really nice example of creating a static web app and deploying a Gatsby app to it. I think I had a site live within like 5 minutes. It was crazy. I was expecting it to be a lot more like pulling teeth. Oh, and then this is the reason I put the asterisk by free. You're still technically paying for your blob storage, but I ran the cost analyst here on my site that's been live for, I think, 6 or 8 months now, something to that effect. It's been a little while. And I'm not seeing any sort of costs on my end. So no cost reported yet for all of 2021. Basically, it's such a small amount of blob storage that Microsoft hasn't even given me a bill for it. There is one drawback I've noticed with static sites, if you're using something like Angular, is they do go cold. So if you haven't hit your site, the first hit in the day, and it's a heavier site, like Gatsby's pretty light, it's pretty responsive, but some of the sites, like an Angular app, do take a little bit to get hot and spin up once you have let them go cold like overnight. But that's the only real drawback I've seen. If you do hit your 100 gig serve limit too, that could be another drawback. Theoretically, your site could just go dead and you wouldn't know why, which isn't fun if you're trying to support that. Especially if you're not the big consumer at your organization, somebody else is serving up a bunch of traffic and just kills you. But also $9 a month isn't anything too insane. Especially 100 gigs on your own plan. I don't think I've hit or will hit anywhere near that. And if your website is getting 100 gigs worth of traffic, that's probably a good problem to have, assuming it's not bot traffic. But that's about all I got. If anybody has any questions, don't know if Derek jumped off.
I have a couple of questions.
Sure, what's up?
The first one is downtime while deploying. Do you know if there is much?
Deployment downtime I've seen is pretty small. It's the thing that's pretty strange to me, and I haven't dug into this too much, is the bicep deploy step is the step that gets mad about it being up, essentially. because the provider behind the scenes goes, okay, I'm serving up a Node Angular app. Then when it goes to run the bicep file, it blows up saying, I can't switch providers. I'm serving up your Angular JavaScript app. So I believe it's back up as soon as like this is done, but it really just depends on how long your deployment process is, I believe. And there's also for mitigation, let's go to here. I haven't looked too far into this, but I believe there is also environments here. So you can, I believe, deploy to environments and promote them kind of like you would with Azure slots. Downtime just hasn't been something that's been a high priority for us to look into, especially on my like personal site, like get like maybe a person or two traffic a week. If it's down for 20, 30 seconds, like doesn't matter. But if you're starting to talk like high availability, that might be something to look into. I believe you get two, let me pull up the thing. I want to say you get 2 free environments on the free tier. Where was that? Sorry, 3. So I'd assume you get probably your production environment and then 2 staging ones. Maybe you do get 3 staging ones altogether. That also gives you the ability to deploy PR changes here. So you could go out and see a live version of a PR if you wanted to. That works for both premium and free. The limitation you'd hit there is just if you are going to have more than 3 developers or more than 3 PRs open.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I think downtime tends to be more of a like theoretical concern than a practical concern, kind of like you mentioned. For a lot of applications, it's not that big a deal. The other thing I was curious about is syncing and how that works for static sites. What I've seen with, at least in some cases, for AWS, like S3 hosting, you may end up with a scenario where there are static resources that were removed from your source control, but they didn't automatically get removed at the S3. And so in this case, they would, if that's true, they would be sitting in blob storage, potentially still served up, even though they're not in your source control anymore. I know in AWS, you kind of have to go through some hoops to get those to sync properly and delete out the unused resources, because you can end up with pages remaining that you don't even want to exist anymore. Do you know anything about how Azure handles that?
I don't off the top of my head. I can get back to you on that.
Well, yeah, I mean, just kind of a curiosity, no big deal.
I would assume since you're doing an update, it doesn't proactively go in and clean itself up. So just a gut check, I would say it probably doesn't delete unused things. So I would think you would probably run into kind of a similar situation of like, I don't know, on your tour of heroes, if you did like a / this page and then you get rid of it, the HTML or whatever, is the minified version might still be out there. I'm not sure. That's a good question.
Cool.
Thanks, Kyle. If there's no other ones, I'm just typing up names here for the Wheel of Names, and we'll give out a Azure t-shirt or 2. All right. Spin for the t-shirt. Looks like Terry Odom. If you want to send me your email address, we can coordinate how to get you that t-shirt.
Will do.
Perfect. I want to say thank you again to all of our great sponsors, and thank you to Carter for being here today for Source Allies. If anybody would like to be a sponsor in the future, feel free to reach out to us. We're looking for a few, and hopefully you can plan for some fun events in the future. But with that, thank you for coming today, and I'll see you all in 2 weeks.
Thanks, Alec.
Hey, or if any of you are interested in presenting, do that as well.
Yeah, thanks for that plug. See y'all in 2 weeks. Thank you.
All right, thanks.